Hi, I'm Heather Vosick, the Dean of Faculty at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and I am here this fourth week of Lent with the Reverend Dr. Drew Smith, who is Professor of Urban Ministry and Director of the Metro Urban Institute here at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. Drew, thanks for taking time this morning to talk through this week's lectionary texts.
Thank you, Heather. Good to be here.
So the assigned texts today come from Numbers, there's a Psalm, there's a reading from Ephesians, and a relatively well-known passage from the Gospel of John. We're going to talk a little bit about the Ephesians text today. It's Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. Why don't you start by talking about themes, topics you see in that passage that might be good for folks to think about as they are thinking about teaching and preaching this text this week.
Indeed. This is a familiar passage, at least to me. This is a passage, very powerful, very important passage that really was central in my own formation as a young person. I mean, this idea that by grace you are saved through faith, that not of your own, but it's the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. I mean, that passage was a very central passage in the circles that formed me. And I think it's a very radical passage, a very radical passage in the sense that it's it sets up a very direct contrast, even a conflict between the natural and the supernatural world. I mean, when you look at the entirety of that passage 1 through 10, it opens up talking about being that we're sort of walking in the ways of the world, the powers, the forces of wickedness in which we once walked. I mean, so that you get these different, and then it moves into the divine agency. So yeah, you get these different dimensions of the supernatural that are very much contrasted to how we position in our human capacity. So this contrast between temporal and spiritual realm, between the agency that we possess and the power and control that is beyond our human capacity. So it's a passage that centers in one respect upon agency. There's divine agency, there's demonic agency, and there's human agency, and then faith, the act of faith, the concept of faith is where human agency really shows up in this passage. It seems to me it's faith is the difference between our living into our divine purposes or not. Are we personally capable of that faith? It seems to me is sort of a subtext. Are we personally capable of living into that faith in ways that turn this conflict, this competition between agencies in the right direction? But even here, it seems to me that the human agency aspect is really qualified. You know, that faith is itself a gift from God. Through faith, but that not of yourself. It's the gift of God, not works, lest anyone should boast. So we get into this contrast between realms of being, life in the passions of the flesh, life in the fullness of the spirit, unto good works. And while in some ways the passage almost makes it seem that these matters are predetermined, I think the passage really allows for outcomes that are actually very far from settled, with again faith seeming to be the real arbiter there. So I would just say that far from lessening the importance of our personal faith, this passage actually radicalizes the act of faith. And I think part of the problem that many have with this passage is that it does seem to lessen the importance of personal faith, of human agency, and seemingly place everything in the hands of these external supernatural forces. But I think that it really does radicalize that personal faith dimension. It's about radical submission, radical devotion, radical self-denial, that kind of John the Baptist faith stance where he says that I must decrease so that God may increase. That kind of radical faith stance, and self-denial, submission, devotion, captured by Jesus's 40 days of fasting in the wilderness. I mean, the whole Lent principle there. So I think this passage is very much a Lent passage.
Mm.
Uh,
Mm.
Ultimately, it's a passage that points to the cross. The cross is the ultimate expression of divine agency and intent toward us. The cross is the ultimate expression of what must become of human agency if we're to live into God's purposes. So
Mm.
human agency here isn't erased, but it is strongly qualified and relativized, including and perhaps especially with respect to our notions of our own religious agency. So yeah,
Mm.
I think agency is at the heart of this passage. Faith being kind of the arbiter between how agency is sort of lived into, and in all sorts of ways that just challenge us to a kind of radical wrestling with those various pulls and tugs on how we sort of move toward godly purpose.
Mm. You talked along the way there about the importance of, or maybe the calling of the question of being capable of faith. And so I'm wondering what that looks like for you, or what the opposite looks like if someone is not capable. I wonder if you have a moment in mind, or a person in mind, or a model of what is it, as something for us to think about in this Lenten journey. What does it look like to be capable of having that kind of faith? What are the fruits of it? What are the practices of it?
Yeah, it seems to me that perhaps we're all brought to that point of encounter where we can exercise, we can live into that sort of sliver of agency that we possess, and decide whether we're going to submit, whether we're going to surrender our own sort of will to the larger will of God, or whether we're going to try to maintain this sense of our own independence from that process. So I think we're all kind of brought to that point of decision, and we handle it differently. And I mean, speaking from my own personal experience, as someone who was very much a part of a salvationist kind of family of Christianity, sort of that wing of the Christian church. It, it um it was precisely in that willingness to concede to the agency of God that transforms experience, transformed my experience. It transforms experience. That willingness to submit, to surrender to God's purpose and God's agency, that puts one on a completely transformed and radicalized course,
Mm-hmm.
is experienced, it's felt, it's real, it's palpable. And at least for me, and for many that I've encountered along the way, who testify of these things in all sorts of powerful ways, about life, about a life that's been changed and transformed, about being born again. I mean, so for me, this passage is really a passage that is at the heart of that way of understanding the operations of faith in one's life, and really very much at the heart of ways of kind of organizing and understanding the Christian experience, in sort of that lead toward these embodiments and expressions of congregational and other denominational ecclesial life within that particular approach. So I've been surrounded by examples of how that becomes real and palpable, and how this passage comes alive. And so for me, this passage is very much a living passage, because not only have I lived it personally and seen it lived out through in others' lives, but it takes me inside that passage and sort of opens it up and reveals it to me in some very powerful and radicalizing ways.
Yeah, I mean, that is the radical part of this, right? This fact that conceding, submitting, that there is such power there. And, our society does not tend to think about conceding, submitting as radical things. But in fact, this passage displays, and that cloud of witnesses around you that you have named, and I can think of similar folks in my world, do that, show that radical nature. So if you were going to preach this text this week, and perhaps you are, where are you thinking you might head with it this week?
Well, yeah, I really think that this passage is very apropos to our day. I mean, it challenges this sense of our agency, like I said, in some very important ways. I'm sure that when Paul penned these words, he probably very much had the Pharisaism of his day in mind. I can see how this has all sorts of applications to the kind of triumphalist religious approaches of our day. I mean, this sense that we kind of control this process, that we're in charge. I mean, this kind of modern Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment era idea that that we operate on the basis of all these powers that emanate from our humanity, that we base, that our reference points are those physical and social realities that we can observe, and that those determine the limits and the possibilities of human existence. So I mean, this whole this secularizing approach, where we kind of dismiss the idea of the invisible as having any real power and force over our lives. It's the observable, not the invisible. It's the perceptible, not the imperceptible, that really controls these outcomes. So yeah, I would look at this passage in a way that would lift up a theme of looking beyond ourselves. I mean, that the importance of being able to see beyond the limits of our own capacities, our own ability to see and observe, to make determinations based upon the kind of sensate world, to bring the supernatural very much back into the center of our approach to an understanding of our own individual paths, our understanding of the life of the church, the witness and the ministry and the mission of the church, that it's not ultimately up to us. Yes, we play a part through faith, we play a part, but at the end of the day, ultimately, these things are in God's hands. It's God's doing and not our doing. It's not our planning. It's not our ability to sort out the issues. Ultimately, yes, we certainly bring ourselves to the occasion fully, because that's all we have. We can only bring ourselves.
Right.
We bring ourselves to the occasion, but not in a way that leads us to believe that it all depends upon us, because these things are God's doing. This is God's work. These are God's purposes ordained in us. God moving us toward these good works, works that were ordained by God, and us for those works. So ultimately, it doesn't depend upon us at the end of the day. It's so that Proverbs 16 verse 9 that talks about how we plan in our hearts our course, but ultimately it's the Lord that establishes our steps. I mean, it's that kind of feel that I think this passage in Ephesians leads us to, that yeah, we have our part to play. We should be vigilant and diligent and in playing our part, but we should enter into that
Mm.
in a way that acknowledges and reverences God's doing in the midst of all that we may bring ourselves to. So yeah, looking beyond ourselves,
Yeah.
getting ourselves, being able to see beyond ourselves, get out of our own way, and to see God working in our midst, being about God's purposes for our lives, drawing us toward those purposes, giving us the gift of faith to be able to make that turn that hopefully we will do at the end of the day, that we will hopefully utilize that degree of agency that we have in this process to make that turn, to allow God to be fully present and purposeful in the way that we approach our individual and our collective and our ministerial
Mm.
lives.
Mm. Mm. I do a bunch of knitting, and as you've been talking, I've been thinking about strands of yarn kind of threaded together in that divine and human agency, and there's a kind of flexibility, conceding, giving in that. In this, I'm in verse 10, for we are what he has made us, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand to be our way of life. So that God us woven together is the image that came to mind. So thank you, Dr. Smith, for time dwelling in this text this week, for those words of wisdom, and for the invitation to remember the gift of faith, the responsibility of faith, the shape of faith individually in the lives of a community. This has been good to be in conversation with you. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been good to reflect on this very powerful passage.
Mm-hmm. And for everybody watching, join us next week, the 5th week of Lent, and we will dig back into another text. Thank you.